"He sees you as a sister," her bestie whispered. Yet the Duke's eyes told a deeper, different truth. The ballroom at Ravensford Hall gleamed under the weight of 100 candles, each flame trembling as if aware of its own insignificance in so grand a space. Clara Whitcombe stood near the tall casement windows, her gloved fingers tracing the condensation upon the glass, her reflection ghostly and uncertain against the lamplight beyond. The orchestra had just fallen silent after a quadrille, and the air hung thick with the mingled scents of beeswax, expensive perfume, and the fading warmth of pressed bodies in silk. She was neither invited to dance nor invited to leave. This was the peculiar station of a clergyman's daughter, visiting as companion to a woman of consequence, present enough to be visible, insignificant enough to be overlooked. Eleanor Beresford appeared at her elbow with the sudden intimacy of long friendship, her fan snapping shut with theatrical precision. "My dearest Clara," she whispered, her voice pitched low but trembling with the kind of excitement that preceded gossip. "I have just heard the most delicious confirmation from Mrs. Ashford herself." Clara turned, though she did not smile. She had learned long ago that Eleanor's delicious confirmations often came at someone's expense, and she harbored a quiet dread that such expense might be her own. "The Duke sees you as a sister," Eleanor breathed, her brown eyes alight with what she evidently believed to be consoling information. "A treasured sister, mind you, but nothing more. Mrs. Ashford observed that he has never once looked upon you with the particular regard one reserves for a woman of romantic consequence. You are safe, Clara, perfectly safe in his indifference." The words fell like stones into still water, each one sinking deeper than the last. Clara's hand stilled upon the window pane. Safe. She turned the word over in her mind as though it were a coin of uncertain value. Safe from hope, then, safe from the possibility of his regard, safe from the terrible, exquisite vulnerability of being truly seen. How reassuring, Clara managed, and the flatness of her own voice surprised her. Eleanor squeezed her hand, entirely satisfied with this response, and turned back toward the throng of dancers and matrons and gentlemen in their tailcoats, eager to disseminate this correction to any who might have harbored wilder notions. Clara watched her go, feeling something within her chest contract into a smaller, harder shape. It was then that she became aware of a presence at the edge of her vision, not aggressive, not demanding, but present in the way that a change in atmospheric pressure announces itself to the skin. Clara did not turn. She could not quite bear to turn, but in the mirror of the darkened window she saw him, Alexander, Duke of Ravensford, standing perhaps 12 feet distant, his posture immaculate, his dark eyes trained upon her with an intensity that made the candlelight seem to dim by contrast. His gaze did not waver. It did not possess the casual, assessing quality one reserves for an acquaintance or a beloved sister. It held instead a weight of recognition, as though he were seeing not merely her reflection, but something far more essential beneath the modest grey silk and the worn gloves and the careful arrangement of ash-brown hair. In that moment, suspended between Eleanor's dismissal and the Duke's unspoken contradiction, Clara understood that some truths arrive not through words, but through the terrible clarity of an unguarded look. The orchestra struck up a waltz. The moment fractured. Yet when she finally dared to glance away from the window, she found him still watching, and she understood, with a certainty that made her breath catch, that Mrs. Ashford was profoundly, devastatingly wrong. The morning after the ball, Clara found herself alone in the library of Ravensford Hall, a vast cathedral-like space where the smell of aged leather and beeswax seemed to promise truths that the drawing-room would never permit. She had taken refuge there under the pretext of retrieving a particular volume for Eleanor, though in truth she sought only the weight of solitude and the company of the dead authors who lined these shelves with their accumulated wisdom. She was running her finger along the spines, Walpole, Milton, the Bronte sisters, whose works were hidden spine inward as though shame could be achieved through architectural positioning, when she heard the measured footfall upon the Persian carpet. There was no hurry in the sound, no surprise. It was the footfall of a man who expected to find what he was looking for. Clara did not turn. Some instinct, born perhaps from the previous evening's revelation, counseled restraint. Let him speak first. Let him bear the weight of words if words there must be. Miss Whitcombe. His voice was pitched low, modulated as though the library itself were a sanctuary requiring reverence. Your taste in literature does you considerable credit. I observe you favor the more demanding philosophers. Clara turned then slowly and found him standing perhaps 10 feet distant, his morning attire immaculate. Charcoal coat, silver waistcoat, the faintest suggestion of a cufflink catching the light that streamed through the tall windows. His dark eyes held that same intensity from the previous evening, but now, in the unforgiving clarity of daylight, there was something else present, a vulnerability, carefully masked but visible to anyone whose own heart had been trained to recognize concealment. "A taste born of necessity rather than accomplishment, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice steadier than her pulse. "A modest companion has limited access to drawing-room conversation, and so the library becomes her society." Something flickered across his features, recognition perhaps, or the admission of a truth he had preferred to leave unspoken. He moved closer, his steps deliberate and measured, and Clara was suddenly acutely aware of the space between them, too small for propriety, too large for true conversation. "I wonder," he said softly, "whether modest companions are not often possessed of deeper observation than women whose every hour is consumed by the dictates of fashion and precedence." He paused, and she saw his hands fold once, twice, as though requiring physical occupation to permit such words to escape his lips. "The glance you exchanged with the window last evening did not escape my notice, Miss Whitcombe, nor did I fail to perceive the particular manner in which you received a certain assessment from Miss Beresford." Clara's breath caught. No one spoke so directly. No one acknowledged what had transpired in drawing-rooms and at ballrooms. The entire edifice of society rested upon the collective agreement to look away from such moments. "I fear you do me too much credit, Your Grace," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Surely a lady of your acquaintance would have claimed your notice far more effectively than a mere—" "You mistake the nature of true regard, Miss Whitcombe," he interrupted, and there was something almost fierce in his composure now, a quality that suggested the maintenance of his usual restraint was costing him considerable effort. "Such regard as I possess is neither casual nor diffuse. When I look upon a woman, I do not require the scaffolding of wealth or connection to perceive her worth. I require only the capacity to see, truly see, what lies before me." He took one step closer. Clara's heart performed a most improper acceleration, "And what I have observed, Miss Clara Whitcombe, is a woman of uncommon intelligence, remarkable restraint, and a dignity that no whisper, no dismissal, no carefully calibrated exclusion can diminish. These qualities are not sisterly. They are, I confess, considerably more perilous to a man's peace of mind." The library seemed to contract around them. Clara's gloved hands trembled slightly as she gripped the spine of the book she had been examining. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the gardens, and somewhere distant, a servant called to another in the matter-of-fact tones of daily life, a reminder that the world continued its ordinary business, indifferent to the seismic shift occurring within these walls. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, "such words are dangerous. For both of us." "Yes," he agreed, and the briefest smile touched his lips, sad, knowing, utterly sincere. "And yet I find myself increasingly unwilling to purchase safety at the cost of truth. Some utterances, once recognized, cannot be unspoken. Some glances, once exchanged, cannot be forgotten." He adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of profound agitation, and stepped back, restoring the space between them to something approximating propriety. "I shall not presume further, Miss Whitcombe, but know this: you are seen, truly seen, and that seeing is not fraternal, though all of society may insist otherwise." When he had gone, leaving only the faint scent of bergamot and the memory of his words suspended in the still air, Clara sank into one of the high-backed chairs and finally permitted her hands to shake. The following afternoon, Eleanor had organized a small gathering in the morning room, a tea of the sort that served as both social obligation and amateur tribunal, where the ladies of the neighborhood assembled ostensibly to discuss charitable works, but in truth convened to assess, critique, and pronounce judgment upon one another's conduct, appearance, and marriageability prospects. Clara attended because attendance was expected. She poured because pouring was her role. She remained mostly silent because silence was her privilege and her burden both. The Duke had not been invited, which should have provided some comfort. Instead, it created an anxious absence, a void against which all other conversations seemed to press and strain. "My dear Eleanor," Mrs. Ashford was saying, her voice carrying that particular pitch of false intimacy that preceded devastating observation, "your companion appears somewhat fatigued. One trusts she is not suffering from romantic disappointment." The assembled ladies permitted themselves small, knowing laughs, the sound of women who understood precisely the mechanisms of such disappointments and took grim satisfaction in their inevitability. Clara's hand did not waver as she added sugar to Mrs. Ashford's cup. "I assure you, Mrs. Ashford, romantic disappointment requires first the existence of romantic possibility, which would require in turn that some gentleman had noticed me as anything other than furniture." The words emerged with more bite than she had intended, and she saw Eleanor's eyes widen with something between alarm and delighted surprise. "How droll," Mrs. Ashford murmured, though her expression suggested otherwise. "And yet, I confess myself surprised by your spiritedness. One might almost believe you harbored some secret grievance against the gentlemen of this county." It was then, and Clara would later wonder whether it was coincidence or some darker orchestration of fate, that the drawing-room door opened without announcement. The Duke stood framed in the doorway, his appearance dishevelled in a manner wholly inconsistent with his usual meticulous grooming, his cravat slightly askew, his hair bearing the marks of repeated passage of his fingers, his expression austere and commanding in equal measure. "Madam," he said to Eleanor, "I must beg your pardon for this intrusion. I find myself in the unaccustomed position of requiring advice from Miss Whitcombe regarding a matter of some scholarly significance. Might I impose upon you to grant her leave to join me in the library for a brief consultation? The matter concerns the correct interpretation of a passage in Walpole which has caused me considerable professional embarrassment." It was absurd. It was transparent. It was entirely, patently false, and every woman in that room understood it to be so. Yet the magic of his title, the weight of his authority, the sheer audacity of his disregard for propriety, created a peculiar paralysis. Eleanor, torn between the delicious scandal of his attention and her social obligation to protect Clara's reputation, seemed momentarily incapable of coherent response. It was Clara who broke the silence. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, setting down her teapot with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. "I should be delighted to provide whatever scholarly assistance lies within my modest capacity." The walk to the library felt both interminable and far too brief. When they had achieved the privacy of those towering shelves and distant windows, the Duke took her hand, an act of such stunning impropriety that Clara could scarcely comprehend it had occurred. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Forgive me for this transgression, but I find myself unable to bear one moment more of your gentle submission to their casual cruelties. You spoke this afternoon with fire. That fire is not sisterly affection, Miss Whitcombe. It is the manifestation of a spirit that deserves recognition, protection, and—" He paused, and his dark eyes held hers with such intensity that she felt she might drown in them. "And love. Authentic, unguarded, terrifying love." Clara's breath came in shallow increments. She should withdraw her hand. She should return to the morning room. She should do any of 1,000 proper things. Instead, she allowed his fingers to remain intertwined with her own and whispered, "Your Grace, you speak of things that cannot be spoken aloud in this world. Then let them be spoken in this room, where truth may exist, without the permission of Mrs. Ashford's approval," he replied. "Let them be written in the language that only we two can read, the language of sustained gazes and hands that tremble and hearts that dare not hope. I am not your brother, Miss Whitcombe. I am a man who has begun to recognize that safety and happiness are often opposing forces, and I find myself increasingly willing to risk the former in pursuit of the latter." Outside, the afternoon light was fading into autumn grey. In this space between propriety and confession, between what the world permitted and what the heart demanded, Clara understood that everything had changed, and nothing could ever be made unspoken again. 3 days had elapsed since that clandestine moment in the library, 3 days of careful orchestration, of measured glances across drawing rooms, of conversations conducted through the precise language of social gesture that had long served as the vocabulary of the aristocracy. The Duke had contrived several occasions upon which Clara might be present without arousing undue suspicion. A scholarly discussion regarding the restoration of the hall's east wing, a consultation regarding Eleanor's charitable endeavours, a quiet afternoon in which he had required her assessment of certain botanical specimens in the glass conservatory. Each encounter had deepened the unspoken understanding between them, yet had also intensified the precariousness of their position. Society remained vigilant, and Eleanor, though increasingly perceptive to the true nature of the Duke's attentions, had begun to regard Clara with an expression that suggested both guilt and a dawning sense of complicity in something that might very well culminate in scandal. It was Eleanor herself who brought the letter on the morning of the fourth day, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the sealed envelope into Clara's fingers. The wax bore no crest, a deliberate precaution, and the handwriting, though unmistakably his, had been rendered deliberately obscure through the application of an unusual angle and the deliberate alteration of certain characteristic flourishes. "Clara," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible in the morning room where they stood alone. "I scarcely know what to say. This arrived by special courier at dawn, addressed to my care with explicit instruction that it be delivered to you privately. I deeply fear that the situation has progressed beyond the bounds of innocent acquaintance." Clara's fingers trembled as she turned the envelope over, awareness flooding through her that this single object represented a crossing of invisible thresholds, a commitment made manifest in paper and wax and ink. "Eleanor, I can explain—" "I do not require explanation," Eleanor interrupted, though her expression suggested otherwise. "I require only that you understand the gravity of what is transpiring. The Duke is a man of honor. This much I do not doubt. But honor and discretion are not always companions, and if this becomes known before he has had opportunity to address it through proper channels, if Mrs. Ashford or her confederates discover evidence of correspondence, your reputation will be torn to shreds, and no amount of his rank can fully repair the damage once such things are set loose among the gossiping classes." "What would you have me do?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer that prudence would demand. "I would have you cease," Eleanor said quietly. "For your own protection, I would have you return that letter unread and withdraw from further private communication. But I suspect," she continued, her voice softening, "that you are rather more courageous than I have given you credit for, and considerably less inclined toward the safety of mediocrity than would be strictly advisable." When Eleanor had gone, pausing at the threshold to offer Clara a sad, knowing glance, Clara broke the seal with fingers that betrayed her internal tumult. The letter was brief, written in the compressed language of a man struggling against the constraints of both passion and propriety. "Dearest Miss Whitcombe, I find myself compelled to commit to paper what circumstances permit only in glances and the careful distances of drawing rooms. These past days have constituted both agony and revelation. To exist in proximity to you whilst maintaining the pretense of casual indifference is a torture of exquisite refinement. I have resolved upon a course of action that will require your consent and, I confess, considerable courage upon your part. There exists a matter of family significance, a legal question that has occupied my solicitor's attention for some months, which I have determined to address openly and without further delay. This matter, when resolved, will create circumstances in which our mutual regard may be acknowledged without the ambiguity that currently constrains us. I cannot ask for your patience without offering, in exchange, my absolute assurance that I am not a man moved by passing fancy or the temporary intoxication of proximity. What I feel toward you has the quality of permanence, of inevitability, of a recognition that runs deeper than the social conventions which presently separate us. Destroy this letter. Do not respond in writing. But know that every moment of every day I am aware of your presence in this house, and I am conscious of nothing so keenly as my determination to see you recognized for precisely what you are. A woman worthy not merely of regard, but of love, expressed openly and without apology. Our Clara pressed the letter to her chest, her heart performing a most dangerous acceleration. The phrase that haunted her, a legal question that has occupied my solicitor's attention, suggested something far more complex than mere romantic impulse. The Duke, it seemed, was orchestrating events toward some conclusion that extended beyond personal feeling into the practical machinery of his estate and his position. She was so absorbed in these reflections that she nearly startled visibly when a knock sounded at the morning room door, followed almost immediately by the arrival of Mrs. Ashford, whose expression bore all the hallmarks of someone who possessed information of a deeply satisfactory nature. "My dear Clara," Mrs. Ashford said, settling herself upon the settee without invitation, "I trust you will forgive this intrusion upon your private time. I have come, in fact, as a bearer of news that I confess myself shocked to have acquired, and which I felt it my obligation as a woman of conscience to convey to you personally, rather than permitting it to circulate through the ordinary channels of gossip." Clara's grip upon the letter tightened imperceptibly. "You are kind to think of me, Mrs. Ashford. There is to be an assembly at the manor next week," Mrs. Ashford continued, her eyes bright with malicious satisfaction, and it appears, though the announcement has not yet been made officially, that the Duke intends to make some sort of pronouncement regarding a significant change in his personal circumstances. Now I had believed, as we all had, that his attentions were directed toward Lady Catherine Hartwick, whose family connections are most excellent and whose fortune would complement his own admirably. And yet I confess myself puzzled by several of his recent behaviors, which might suggest that his affections have taken a more unexpected direction. The implications hung suspended between them, like a sword suspended by a thread. Clara forced herself to meet Mrs. Ashford's gaze with an expression of polite interest. "I cannot imagine, madam, that the Duke's personal arrangements are a matter of particular significance to anyone save himself." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Ashford conceded, rising to her feet with an air of supreme satisfaction, "and yet should his unexpected attachment prove to be toward someone of humble circumstance, I trust you will understand that certain precautions regarding one's reputation must be observed. Society can be remarkably unforgiving toward young women who rise above their station through means that are not precisely conventional." When she had departed, Clara sank into a chair, the letter burning against her palm like a live coal. The Assembly, next week. Some pronouncement regarding a significant change in his personal circumstances. She understood, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that the Duke had made a decision, and that everything, her reputation, her future, her very identity, now hung upon whatever revelation he intended to make public before the assembled gentry of the county. The 5 days preceding the Assembly constituted a period of such emotional extremity that Clara found herself moving through the hours of each day as though inhabiting a dream from which waking was increasingly unlikely. Eleanor had begun to regard her with an expression of anxious complicity, and even the servants seemed aware that something of significance impended, though none possessed sufficient information to speak of it with certainty. The Duke maintained an outward demeanour of absolute normalcy, perhaps even more rigidly composed than usual, which itself served as evidence of the internal tempest he laboured to contain. Yet there had been one moment, a single precious instant, when he had contrived to encounter her alone in the portrait gallery, and in that brief interval before propriety demanded he withdraw, he had taken her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a gesture so full of tenderness and resignation that Clara had understood he was preparing for something that might very well destroy them both. "Whatever occurs," he had whispered, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to convey an entire library of unuttered words, "know that it is born entirely from the conviction that your worth, your dignity, your exceptional character demands to be acknowledged openly, regardless of the cost to my own position. I have lived too long in the shadows of propriety. I will not permit you to remain there a moment longer than necessary." It was these words that Clara turned over in her mind continuously as she prepared for the Assembly. Words that suggested both promise and peril in nearly equal measure. What could he possibly intend? What revelation could be of such magnitude as to warrant this systematic preparation, this careful orchestration of circumstance? The Assembly room was transformed for the occasion into something approaching magnificence. The walls were draped in autumn gold silk. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, and candles had been positioned with such profusion that the entire space seemed to float in warm, trembling light. The assembled gentry of the county, some 200 souls in all, filled the room with the susurration of silk and wool, the percussion of conversation, and the underlying current of anticipation that suggested something beyond the ordinary had been promised. Eleanor appeared beside Clara just as the musicians were tuning their instruments, her fair curls arranged with unusual care, and her expression suggesting that she had been brought into some form of confidence regarding the evening's purpose. "You look beautiful, Clara," she said quietly, taking her hand. "Whatever occurs tonight, I wish you to know that I have been grossly unfair in my earlier dismissal of his regard for you. I perceive now that I was blind to what should have been obvious from the beginning." Before Clara could respond, the orchestra struck up a waltz, and the assembled crowd began to arrange itself in the patterns of conventional dancing. The Duke appeared in the doorway, his dress more formal than she had ever observed, his bearing suggesting the gravity of a man about to commit an irrevocable act. His dark eyes found hers across the crowded room, and he began to move toward her with a purposefulness that caused the dancers to part before him, as though compelled by some force beyond ordinary politeness. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, extending his hand, "Would you honor me with this dance?" There was a collective inhalation throughout the assembly. The Duke never danced. It was known that he considered such public demonstrations of sentiment to be beneath the dignity of his station. That he should break this long-established custom, and do so whilst selecting a partner of such modest circumstances, created a disturbance in the social atmosphere that was nearly audible in its intensity. Clara placed her gloved hand in his, and he drew her into the patterns of the waltz with a grace and certainty that suggested the dance itself had been choreographed as an expression of things that words could not adequately convey. As they moved through the turns and spirals, she felt his hand upon her waist, proper, restrained, yet somehow conveying a tenderness so profound that her breath caught in her throat. "You must be prepared," he said softly, his voice pitched so that only she could hear it above the strains of the orchestra, "for what is to come. What I am about to do will cause considerable disturbance, and there will be those who will attempt to convince you that it has been folly, impropriety, a betrayal of my duty. But I find that duty and conscience have come into irreconcilable conflict, and I am resolved to choose conscience." "Your Grace," Clara whispered, "I am afraid, not for myself, but for you. Your position." "My position is secure only if I am willing to sacrifice what matters most," he interrupted. "And I have come to understand that no title, however ancient, no estate, however vast, can compete with the alternative of a life lived in the constant, grinding knowledge that I have chosen propriety over truth." The waltz drew to its conclusion. As the final notes faded into silence, the Duke maintained her hand within his own, and in direct defiance of all convention, conducted her toward the small dais upon which the musicians were positioned. He raised his other hand, and the assembled crowd gradually fell silent, sensing that something of magnitude impended. "I have gathered you here this evening," the Duke announced, his voice carrying with perfect clarity to the furthest reaches of the room, "to make a pronouncement regarding a matter of both personal and legal significance. For some months past, my solicitor has been engaged in investigating a certain irregularity in the records pertaining to the estate of my late mother, an investigation which has resulted in the discovery that substantial funds, intended by her will to establish a foundation for the education and welfare of women of modest means, were, through the incompetence and deliberate malfeasance of certain administrators, diverted from their intended purpose." A murmur rippled through the assembly. This was not, Clara realized, what anyone had anticipated. "These funds have been recovered," the Duke continued, "and I am pleased to announce that they will be employed precisely according to my mother's original intention, the establishment of a school for girls of humble circumstance, staffed by educators of the highest caliber, and governed according to principles that recognize intelligence and character as the true measures of human worth, regardless of social position or family connection." He paused, and his dark eyes found hers with such directness that Clara felt her heart cease its ordinary rhythm. "I am further pleased to announce that I have invited Miss Clara Whitcombe, a woman whose own character exemplifies the very principles upon which this foundation shall be established, to serve as the institution's headmistress and principal architect of its curriculum. This position carries with it both remuneration and independence sufficient to permit Miss Whitcombe to exercise complete authority over all matters pertaining to the school's operation and governance." The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and utterly unprecedented. What had been a potential scandal, a nobleman's improper attachment to a woman of no fortune, had been transformed, through the application of careful legal machinery and the redirection of funds that could not be openly questioned, into something approaching respectability. Not acceptance, perhaps, not yet, but sufficient cover to permit their continued proximity without the immediate threat of absolute ruin. As Clara stood before the assembled county, her hand still resting in the Duke's, she understood that he had made a sacrifice of his own. The public revelation of this school, this dedication of his mother's legacy, would bind him to certain philanthropic obligations that might otherwise have seemed beneath his station. But he had done it, had reconfigured the very architecture of his public life in order to create a space in which they might exist together without the constant terror of exposure. When he finally released her hand, he bowed with exquisite formality, and as the assembled crowd began to process toward the refreshment rooms, their minds already spinning with the implications of this extraordinary announcement, Clara found herself trembling with the weight of what his gesture had signified. Not merely love, but the willingness to reshape his entire existence in service to truth. The week that followed the assembly was consumed by the peculiar chaos that accompanies the disruption of established social patterns. Letters arrived from various quarters of the county, some congratulatory, some cautiously curious, and several bearing the undisguised venom of those who perceived Clara's advancement as an affront to the natural order of things. Mrs. Ashford appeared twice at Eleanor's home, ostensibly to discuss the forthcoming school, but in truth to extract additional details regarding the nature of Clara's prior relationship with the Duke, her family connections, and whether there might not be some impropriety in the arrangement that society had somehow overlooked. Yet there was also, to Clara's considerable surprise, an undertone of begrudging respect. The Duke had managed, through the canny application of charitable intention and family legacy, to render his actions legitimate in the eyes of those who might otherwise have condemned them without hesitation. A school for girls was beyond reproach. It was precisely the sort of endeavor that demonstrated moral seriousness and a commitment to the betterment of society's less fortunate members. It was during the third day of this strange interregnum that the Duke contrived to meet Clara alone in the conservatory, the space filled with the moist heat of carefully cultivated botanical specimens and the faint perfume of flowering plants that thrived in the controlled warmth of glass and careful attention. "I have received the preliminary sketches for the school," he said without preamble, producing a leather portfolio from beneath his coat. "The architect has been remarkably responsive to my specifications, and I confess myself eager to know your assessment of the proposed design." They bent over the drawings together, their shoulders nearly touching, and Clara was conscious of nothing so keenly as the intimacy of their proximity and the careful, deliberate formality with which they conducted this discussion. A performance, she understood, in case anyone should chance upon them and require justification for their private conversation. "The library provisions are excellent," she said, tracing her gloved finger along the sketched outline, "though I might suggest an expansion of the natural philosophy classroom. If we are to instruct young women according to rational principles rather than mere accomplishment, they must have access to equipment that permits genuine experimentation." "Your suggestions will be incorporated," the Duke replied, and she heard in his voice the particular tenderness reserved for moments when propriety permitted him to acknowledge his regard without explicit declaration. "I have, in fact, already made provision for such expenses in the initial budget. I anticipated that you would recognize the necessity." They continued in this manner for some time, discussing practical matters of architecture and curriculum, yet with each exchange, Clara became increasingly aware that they were conducting a conversation that existed simultaneously on two distinct levels, one of legitimate professional discussion, and another, more profound, more dangerous, of an intimacy that society was only just beginning to tolerate. It was the Duke who eventually shifted the conversation toward the matter that had been occupying both their minds with increasing urgency. "There remains, however, a certain question that extends beyond the practical arrangements of the school," he said quietly, setting aside the drawings and turning to face her fully. "A question that touches upon the nature of our mutual understanding and the future course of our association." Clara's breath caught. She understood precisely what he intended, and her heart performed a peculiar unsettling acceleration. "Your Grace," she whispered. "You must not—" "I must," he interrupted gently. "For 3 weeks, I have sustained myself through the exercise of extraordinary restraint. I have permitted society to dictate the terms of our interaction, to circumscribe our conversation within the bounds of what is permissible, to render invisible the fundamental truth of my regard for you. But I find myself increasingly unable to maintain this pretense, and I am resolved to address the matter with the directness it deserves, irrespective of the circumstances or the appropriateness of the moment." He took her hand, a gesture performed without the mediation of gloves, skin meeting skin in a contact that was simultaneously forbidden and inevitable. "Clara," he said, and the use of her given name, spoken in that low, trembling voice, seemed to reshape the very air between them. "I am aware that society has dictated certain constraints upon the nature of our association. I am aware that your position, though considerably elevated by the appointment I have created, remains fundamentally dependent upon your behavior remaining beyond reproach. I am aware of all these things, and I find them to be profoundly unjust." He released her hand and reached instead into his waistcoat pocket, producing a small object that caught the light filtering through the glass panels of the conservatory. It was a ring, not a contemporary piece of obvious value, but something far older, bearing the marks of considerable age and a craftsmanship that suggested generations of careful stewardship. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he continued, his voice rough with emotion, "a woman who defied considerable social opposition to marry a man whom she loved profoundly, despite his lack of family connection or substantial fortune. She was a woman of remarkable strength, and I have always believed her to be the source of whatever moral clarity I possess. I offer this ring now, not as a symbol of conventional engagement, an arrangement which would, I confess, immediately render you vulnerable to the precise scrutiny and suspicion that the school was designed to circumvent, but as a symbol of my intention, my commitment, and my absolute determination that you shall not remain invisible, unacknowledged, or dependent upon society's sufferance for your rightful place in this world." He extended the ring toward her, and Clara found herself unable to do anything but stare at it, comprehension and emotion warring within her in equal measure. "I am not asking you to become my wife according to the forms that would currently protect you and legitimize your position," he continued softly. "I am asking you something far more difficult. I am asking you to trust that I am capable of navigating the labyrinthine complexities of society's expectations whilst maintaining unwavering commitment to your dignity and your worth. I am asking you to believe that love, authentic, unconditional, permanent love, is a foundation upon which a life may be built, even when that foundation must, for the present, remain partially obscured from public view." Clara looked up at him, and in that moment she understood that she stood at a threshold that, once crossed, would remake the entire architecture of her life. The ring represented not conformity to society's expectations, but a deliberate, conscious defiance of them, an assertion that some truths transcended the permission of propriety, and that some loves demanded to be acknowledged regardless of the cost. "Yes," she whispered, though she was not entirely certain which of his implications she was accepting: the ring, the commitment, the future he was proposing, or simply the terrifying, exhilarating necessity of choosing authenticity over safety. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been waiting through generations for this precise moment, and for a long moment they stood in silence amid the humid warmth of the conservatory, whilst outside the autumn light began its descent toward evening, and the world continued its indifferent rotation, unaware that everything had fundamentally changed. 14 days elapsed between the moment the ring was placed upon Clara's finger and the evening upon which the most significant public revelation was orchestrated. These days were occupied by a peculiar suspension between worlds. Clara's professional identity as head mistress designate of the foundation had been formally announced and accepted by society, yet her true relationship with the Duke remained concealed beneath layers of propriety and careful management. The ring was worn, but beneath her gloves, where only she and the Duke were aware of its presence. Eleanor had been taken into fuller confidence, and her complicity in the deception had transformed her from an occasional confidant into an active conspirator. It was she who provided the excuse for Clara's frequent absences from the drawing room, who created opportunities for private conversation, who gradually began to circulate the subtle suggestion that Clara's character and education made her an appropriate associate for a man of the Duke's intellectual pretensions, regardless of her modest origins. The mechanism of social rehabilitation was slow, but perceptible. Women who had previously ignored Clara began to acknowledge her with qualified civility. Invitations to tea became increasingly frequent. Even Mrs. Ashford's manner, whilst never entirely cordial, had acquired a tinge of reluctant deference, acknowledgement that the Duke's patronage, however unusual its genesis, conferred a form of legitimacy that society could not entirely dismiss. Yet with each day that passed, Clara became increasingly aware of a tension building between what was being constructed, her new identity as educator and woman of consequence, and what remained unresolved between herself and the Duke. They had not spoken of marriage in explicit terms. They had not discussed the future in any concrete manner. The ring upon her finger was a promise, yes, but a promise of what precisely remained undefined, pregnant with possibility and shadowed by uncertainty. It was Eleanor who finally articulated what had become impossible to ignore. She found Clara alone in the morning room, engaged in the preliminary sketches for the school's curriculum, and sat beside her with an expression of determined urgency. "The tension between you cannot continue indefinitely," Eleanor said without preamble. "The Duke has been remarkably patient and remarkably clever in his management of the situation. But society's tolerance for ambiguity is limited, and there are those, Mrs. Ashford chief among them, who are beginning to whisper that perhaps the arrangement is not quite as innocent as the charitable school might suggest. What do they suggest? Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. That you have become his mistress, Eleanor replied bluntly. That the school is merely an elaborate screen for a relationship that would otherwise render you utterly condemned. There are even darker whispers, that perhaps he intends to seduce you, and then abandon you once society has grown accustomed to your presence. You must understand, Clara, that no amount of professional accomplishment can entirely insulate you from such speculation if it is permitted to establish itself in the collective imagination. Clara's hands stilled upon her sketches. She understood with terrible clarity that Eleanor was correct. The protection afforded by the school was already beginning to erode in the face of society's need to interpret their relationship through the only frameworks it truly understood, frameworks rooted in scandal, seduction, and the inevitable humiliation of a woman who had overreached her station. It was that very evening that the Duke requested Clara's presence in the library, a summons delivered through Eleanor with the instruction that they were to discuss certain matters pertaining to the school's governance. Yet when Clara entered the library at the appointed hour, she found it arranged for something far more significant. A small fire burned in the hearth, and the Duke stood before it with an expression of such profound gravity that her heart immediately contracted with apprehension. "I have received intelligence," he began without preamble, "that the nature of our association is beginning to be questioned in a manner that threatens not merely your reputation, but the very foundation upon which the school rests. It appears that society's generosity toward eccentric patronage has its limits, and those limits are being rapidly approached." Eleanor mentioned as much, Clara admitted quietly. "What do you propose?" "I propose," he said, moving toward her with measured steps, "that we cease to conduct our arrangement under the auspices of concealment. What I propose is that you understand the true nature of my intentions, and that we move, with deliberate purpose and public acknowledgement, toward the conclusion that has been inevitable since the moment you permitted me to place this ring upon your finger." He took her hand, the one bearing the ring visible now in the firelight, and pressed it briefly to his lips. "I am asking you, Clara, to become my wife. Not in secret, not through some clandestine arrangement that would render you perpetually vulnerable to speculation and doubt, but openly, before the county and before God, with all the rights and protections that such a union would afford you." Clara found herself unable to speak. She had known this was coming, had perhaps always known, and yet the articulation of it rendered her simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. "I recognize," he continued, "that this represents a departure from society's ordinary expectations. I am aware that certain factions will view this marriage as a betrayal of my duty to my lineage and my estate. I am aware that there will be those who will never fully accept you, who will regard you as an unsuitable match, regardless of your considerable personal accomplishments. But I have come to understand that these objections, whilst inconvenient, are ultimately immaterial in the face of what I have come to recognize as a fundamental truth. I cannot imagine a future that does not include you as its center. I cannot imagine conducting my life, my work, my responsibilities in any manner that does not have your welfare and your happiness as its primary concern." He released her hand and took a step back, his expression suddenly vulnerable in a manner she had rarely witnessed. "I am asking you to trust me with your future, Clara, not as a woman of modest means seeking advancement through matrimonial connection, but as an equal partner in whatever we might construct together." "Your Grace," Clara began, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "Before you respond," he said quietly, "you should know that I have already taken certain steps to ensure that this marriage, should you consent to it, will be conducted in a manner that is not merely socially acceptable, but impossible to question. I have in fact prepared a document of some significance, one that I would like to place before you now." He moved to the desk and retrieved a leather folio, which he opened to reveal a series of carefully inscribed pages. "These are the amended provisions of my will," he explained. "They establish certain trusts, certain guarantees of independence and security that will be held in your name, regardless of the outcome of our marriage or any other contingency that might arise. Should you become my wife and should any misfortune subsequently befall me, you will inherit not merely a portion of my estate, but sufficient independent wealth to ensure that you need never be dependent upon anyone for your security or your autonomy." Clara stared at the documents, comprehending their significance. He was not merely asking her to marry him, He was arranging, through the careful deployment of legal machinery, to ensure that she would never be rendered powerless or vulnerable, that marriage to him would represent an accumulation of security rather than a surrender of it. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," he replied simply. "Say yes and allow me the privilege of spending the remainder of my life ensuring that no whisper, no speculation, no doubt ever again threatens your peace of mind or your rightful place in this world." He extended his hand toward her, and Clara, moving as though in a dream, placed hers within it. In that moment, illuminated by the firelight that cast dancing shadows across the library's ancient shelves, she understood that she had been given something far more precious than a mere proposal. She had been offered a partnership predicated upon radical equality, upon the absolute refusal to permit social convention to diminish or constrain her. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I will become your wife. Yes, I will trust you with my future. Yes, I will allow the world to bear witness to what we have come to understand in silence." He drew her close then, a gesture that, in that private moment, transcended propriety and convention entirely. And when he spoke, his voice held all the tenderness, all the recognition, all the love that had been accumulating through weeks of restrained glances and carefully managed distances. "Then let us proceed," he murmured against her hair, "to remake the world according to the dictates of truth rather than the demands of convention." The announcement of the Duke's intention to marry Miss Clara Whitcombe was delivered to the assembled county through the mechanism of a formal notice in the parish register, followed by the publication of the intention in 3 successive Sundays service announcements. This bureaucratic formality served multiple purposes. It provided legitimate grounds for the marriage, it created an opportunity for any hidden impediments to surface, and it signaled with unmistakable clarity that this union was not a sudden, precipitous decision, but rather one that had been reached through careful deliberation and formal process. The reaction was, as might have been anticipated, complex and varied. Certain quarters of society accepted the announcement with relatively gracious composure, viewing it as an eccentric but ultimately acceptable choice on the Duke's part, particularly given the establishment of the charitable school, which had begun to acquire a positive reputation in progressive circles. Others regarded it as a betrayal of aristocratic duty, a squandering of a title's matrimonial prospects upon someone whose family connections could do nothing to enhance the Duke's standing or position. Mrs. Ashford, however, proved to be Clara's most surprising advocate. Having initially regarded the school establishment with suspicion, she had gradually come to perceive in its success a source of considerable local prestige. The Duke's charitable endeavour had attracted the attention of several prominent philanthropists from London, and there was the distinct possibility that the school might become something of a showpiece, a demonstration of progressive thinking that might reflect favourably upon the entire county. Accordingly, Mrs. Ashford's attitude toward Clara underwent a subtle transformation, from barely concealed contempt to something approaching cautious respect. "I confess myself astounded by the perspicacity of the Duke's choice," Mrs. Ashford remarked to Eleanor during a morning call, sufficiently aware that Eleanor would convey her words to Clara, "though I suppose one must acknowledge that Miss Whitcombe does possess certain qualities that render her suitable for the responsibilities she is to assume. Her education, whilst humble in its origins, appears to have equipped her with a remarkable grasp of pedagogical principle." It was not precisely an endorsement, but it was something more valuable. It was permission for society to revise its assessment without losing face. The 3 weeks preceding the wedding were occupied by a peculiar admixture of practical preparation and emotional intensity. The Duke had insisted upon a ceremony of considerable significance, not the quiet, hurried affair that might have been expected, but rather a formal celebration to be held in the parish church with the assembled county in attendance. This decision was partly, Clara understood, an assertion of normalcy, a declaration that this marriage was not shameful or clandestine, but rather a union worthy of public recognition. It was Eleanor who undertook the responsibility of ensuring Clara's preparation for the occasion, and she approached this task with the dedication of someone atoning for previous skepticism. The wedding dress was commissioned from a modiste in the county town, a gown of ivory silk with the faintest suggestion of silver embroidery, elegant and refined without being ostentatious. The flowers were chosen with meticulous care, white roses interspersed with sprigs of lavender, symbols of virtue and constancy, bound together with silver ribbon. "You will be beautiful," Eleanor assured her during a fitting, as Clara stood upon a raised platform while seamstresses made final adjustments to the hem. "More than beautiful, you will be luminous. The Duke is a man of considerable discernment, and I begin to perceive precisely what attracted him to you in the first place. It was not your modest origins or your lack of fortune that drew his attention, but rather something far more essential: your refusal to be diminished by circumstances, your capacity to maintain dignity in the face of dismissal." The night before the wedding, Clara found herself unable to sleep, her mind occupied by a peculiar mixture of anticipation, residual anxiety, and the strange sensation of standing upon the threshold of a new existence. She rose in the darkness, and wrapping herself in a dressing gown, made her way downstairs to the library. That space which had become, over the preceding weeks, a repository of all that was most significant in her relationship with the Duke. She was surprised to find the room illuminated, and more surprised still to discover the Duke himself, seated in one of the high-backed chairs, a volume of poetry open upon his lap, though his eyes were fixed upon the darkness beyond the windows rather than upon the pages before him. "I could not sleep," he said simply, as though her appearance had been entirely anticipated. "I find myself occupied by a peculiar consciousness of impending transformation. Tomorrow the world will regard you as my wife, rather than as a woman of questionable connection. Tomorrow society's verdict will be sealed, and whatever objections remain will be rendered mute by the formality of our union. And yet, I confess myself aware that tomorrow, from a personal perspective, changes very little. My regard for you, my commitment to your welfare, my recognition of your worth, these remain constant regardless of whether they are expressed through the machinery of matrimony or through some other form of association." Clara moved to sit beside him, and he reached out to take her hand, his thumb moving gently across the curve of her knuckles in a gesture of such tenderness that it seemed to encompass all the restraint, all the longing, all the careful management of propriety that had characterized their preceding weeks of acquaintance. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly, "not of marrying you, but of the possibility that marriage might diminish what we have created together, that the formalization of our relationship might render it ordinary, unremarkable, subject to the same tired conventions that govern all matrimonial arrangements." "That is a legitimate fear," he replied, his voice carrying that particular quality of gravitas that suggested he was engaging seriously with her concern, rather than dismissing it as feminine nervousness. "Yet I would suggest to you that what we have created is sufficiently resilient to survive the transition from concealment to acknowledgement. The foundation of our understanding is not built upon secrecy or transgression, but rather upon mutual recognition and the deliberate choice to value truth above propriety. Those elements will not be diminished by the addition of a marriage certificate. If anything, they will be strengthened by it." He set aside his volume of poetry and turned to face her more fully. "Tomorrow I will stand before the parish and declare my intention to bind my life to yours. But I want you to understand that this declaration is merely the public articulation of a binding that has already occurred in the more essential realm of spirit and conviction. You are already mine, Clara, in all the ways that matter. The ceremony tomorrow merely translates that internal reality into a form that society can comprehend and grudgingly acknowledge. And yet there is something that will change," Clara said softly, understanding with sudden clarity what had been troubling her beneath the surface of her anxiety. "Once we are married, once I am the Duchess, I will be locked into a role, constrained by expectations that extend far beyond our private understanding. I will be required to behave in a manner consistent with your station, to conduct myself according to standards that may conflict with my own inclinations. You will be required," he corrected gently, "to conduct yourself with dignity and grace, but you will never be required to surrender your authenticity or your integrity. And I give you my absolute assurance that should society's expectations ever demand that you compromise either of those qualities, you will find in me an advocate who is willing to challenge society's verdicts with whatever force is necessary." He released her hand and rose to his feet, extending it to help her upright. "We should return to our respective chambers," he said with a faint smile that suggested the exercise of considerable restraint. "Propriety demands that we not be found alone together on the eve of our wedding, and I confess myself not yet entirely prepared to dispense with propriety on all fronts simultaneously. Tomorrow I will have eternity to ensure that you understand the depth of my regard. Tonight I will content myself with the knowledge that you trust me sufficiently to commit your future into my keeping." As Clara climbed the stairs to her chamber, the Duke's words echoing in the silence behind her, she found that her earlier anxiety had transformed into something altogether different, a quiet certainty that whatever challenges the future might present, she would face them in partnership with a man whose commitment to her welfare transcended the ordinary mechanisms of matrimonial obligation. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn brightness that seemed to promise benediction from the very heavens. The parish church had been decorated with flowers, white roses, lavender, and sprigs of ivy that suggested both elegance and constancy, arranged with meticulous care by Eleanor, and an army of enthusiastic helpers drawn from among the village women who had come to regard the establishment of the school as a source of considerable local pride. The assembled congregation represented a cross-section of the county's social hierarchy: country gentlemen in their formal dress, their wives attired in their finest gowns and most elaborate bonnets, younger women craning to glimpse the bride, elderly matrons positioned with the authority of those whose long observation of social proprieties granted them the right to judge whether this union was, ultimately, acceptable. Even the tenant farmers had turned out, standing at the rear of the church in their Sunday clothes, their presence serving as testament to the Duke's popularity among his working people. Eleanor stood as Clara's attendant, having insisted upon the role despite the complications it created for her own social standing. As Clara made final adjustments to her veil, a creation of the most delicate Brussels lace, Eleanor embraced her with genuine warmth. "You are remarkable," Eleanor said simply, stepping back to survey her friend with undisguised admiration. "I confess that I did not perceive this possibility at the beginning of the season, but I find myself profoundly moved by the courage with which you have navigated these extraordinary circumstances. The Duke is a fortunate man." The organ struck up the traditional hymn, and Clara moved toward the aisle with a steadiness that surprised her. She had anticipated nerves, perhaps even a degree of hesitation, yet instead she found herself moving with the sense of inevitability that accompanies the moment when one crosses a threshold that cannot subsequently be uncrossed. This was transformation made manifest. In a few moments she would cease to be Miss Clara Whitcombe and become instead the Duchess of Ravensford, a title that carried with it both privilege and unprecedented visibility. The Duke stood at the altar, and as she approached, Clara observed that his customary composure had been fractured by what appeared to be genuine emotion. His dark eyes held hers as she reached his side, and in that glance there was conveyed an entire library of recognition and commitment. The ceremony proceeded according to the ancient rituals that had governed matrimonial unions for centuries. The vicar pronounced the traditional words, Clara and the Duke exchanged vows, and at the final moment, the moment in which the ring was placed upon her finger, the Duke spoke words that were not part of the liturgy, spoken so softly that only she could hear them. "I see you, Clara. I have always seen you. I will spend the remainder of my life ensuring that the world learns to see you as I do." The assembled congregation erupted into applause as they emerged from the church into the autumn sunlight, a gesture of approval that seemed to seal what had transpired within those walls. Society, Clara understood, had rendered its verdict. This marriage was acceptable. The union of a duke with a woman of modest origins was not merely tolerable, but even, in certain progressive circles, regarded as admirably principled. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Ravensford, transformed by candlelight and flowers into something approaching magical. Tables laden with delicacies were positioned throughout the space, and a string quartet played softly in one corner, providing the atmospheric accompaniment to celebration and conversation. It was during this reception that Mrs. Ashford approached Clara with an expression of mingled satisfaction and something approaching genuine warmth. "I must acknowledge, Your Grace," she said, employing the new title with careful precision, "that you have managed a feat of considerable social acumen, not merely a marriage, but a transformation. You have elevated yourself from a position of questionable respectability to one of considerable consequence, and you have done so without generating sufficient scandal as to render yourself utterly condemned. Few women possess such skill in the navigation of society's treacherous waters." "I confess," Clara replied with a composure that surprised even herself, "that my elevation has been less a matter of personal acumen than of extraordinary good fortune in encountering a man who valued authenticity above propriety. I cannot claim credit for the machinations that rendered this union possible, I can only acknowledge the Duke's unwavering commitment to a principle that society rarely permits itself to acknowledge, that love, genuine and unconditional, transcends the boundaries of class and circumstance. As the afternoon progressed and the celebration continued around her, Clara found herself increasingly aware of the Duke's presence, not demanding attention, but present, a constant point of reference toward which her consciousness repeatedly turned. When he finally approached her as the light was beginning to fade, his expression carried a question and a promise in equal measure. "It is customary," he said, extending his hand, "for the newly married couple to absent themselves from the festivities at a certain point in the proceedings. I wonder whether you might be inclined to accommodate this tradition." Clara placed her hand in his without hesitation, and he led her away from the great hall, through corridors lit by candlelight, toward a chamber she had not previously entered. It was his private study, she understood, a space of considerable intimacy, lined with books and dominated by a large window that overlooked the gardens. "I wish to speak with you," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of emotion that suggested something of significance impended, away from the observation of society and the machinery of public celebration. "I wish to have a moment in which we could exist simply as ourselves, without the mediation of titles or expectations, or the carefully managed performance that our union has, of necessity, required." He took both her hands, and Clara saw in his dark eyes a vulnerability that few could perceive beneath his customary composure. "I want you to understand, Clara, that what we have created together, what has transpired over these past weeks, represents for me a form of resurrection. I had believed myself capable of existing indefinitely within the confines of duty and restraint, of conducting my life according to principles that demanded the suppression of authentic feeling. And then you arrived with your quiet dignity and your refusal to be diminished by circumstance, and you shattered those carefully constructed defenses." He released her hands and reached instead for something upon his desk, the torn corner of a dance card, the scrap that had fallen from her notebook weeks earlier when society's cruelty had rendered her nearly invisible. "I have kept this," he said softly, "as a reminder of the moment at which I understood that all the wealth, all the lineage, all the accumulated prestige of my position meant nothing if it did not permit me the autonomy to choose what matters most." This scrap of paper represented exclusion. Today I wanted to seal it as a symbol of transformation, not of your transformation, but of mine. Your commitment to me has remade me into something approaching authenticity. He produced a stick of sealing wax, and holding the fragment over the candle flame, carefully sealed it with wax, bearing the ducal crest, a gesture so profoundly symbolic that Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. "This," he said, placing the sealed fragment into her hand, "is the testimony of our love rendered permanent and official. It is proof that the world, reluctant though it may be, has been compelled to acknowledge what we have always known. That truth, when sufficiently insisted upon, renders propriety powerless, and that love, authentic and unflinching, is the only legitimacy that matters." He drew her into an embrace then, one that was tender and passionate in equal measure, and as Clara allowed herself to rest against him, she understood that she had been offered something far more valuable than a title or social elevation. She had been offered genuine recognition, complete and unconditional, by a man whose commitment to truth had transformed not merely her circumstances, but the very architecture of her understanding of herself. Outside, the autumn darkness was descending upon the gardens, and somewhere in the great hall the celebration continued. But within this private space, suspended between one life and another, Clara understood that the greatest transformation had already occurred, not in the eyes of society, but in the quiet certainty of her own heart. 6 months had elapsed since the wedding, and the transformation that had begun in the library on that autumn evening had deepened and solidified into something approaching permanence. The school, now formally established and bearing the official designation of the Ravensford Foundation for the Education of Women, had begun to acquire a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the county. Young women of modest circumstances, daughters of tradesmen, clergymen and professional men, arrived from as far as London and Bath, drawn by the promise of an education that was rigorous without being genteel, practical without being demeaning. Clara had thrown herself into the work of establishment with a dedication that left little time for the peculiar isolation that often accompanied elevation to the rank of Duchess. The Duke, demonstrating a perspicacity that continued to surprise even those who had come to know him well, had arranged for her to maintain operational control of the school whilst providing the administrative and financial support necessary for its expansion. In this manner, Clara had managed to preserve the autonomy that was essential to her character, whilst simultaneously acquiring the legitimacy and resources that only the Duke's position could provide. It was on a spring afternoon, the gardens of Ravensford beginning their annual resurrection, the air carrying that particular quality of renewal that made winter seem impossible, that Eleanor arrived for one of her increasingly frequent visits, bearing intelligence that immediately altered the trajectory of Clara's thoughts. "There is to be a visitor of some consequence," Eleanor announced, settling herself in the drawing room with the air of someone about to impart information of considerable significance. "I have received word from my contacts in London that the Countess of Ashfield intends to visit the school. She is, as you may or may not be aware, a woman of considerable influence in progressive circles, and she has expressed a particular desire to observe the educational methodologies that you have implemented." Clara set down her needlework, her mind immediately calculating the implications of such a visit. The Countess of Ashfield was known throughout England as a patron of educational reform, and a woman whose endorsement could transform an institution from being regarded as a mere eccentricity into something approaching the status of a legitimate educational innovation. "When is she to arrive?" Clara asked, her voice betraying the slight tremor that accompanied the prospect of so significant a scrutiny. "Within a fortnight," Eleanor replied, "and the Duke, I understand, has already been informed. He seems remarkably untroubled by the prospect, which suggests that he has anticipated such developments and has been orchestrating circumstances to facilitate them." Indeed, when Clara subsequently broached the matter with the Duke, she found his response to be characterized by an almost unsettling calm. They were in his study, a space that had become increasingly common ground between them as their marriage had progressed from the initial intensity of revelation into something approaching genuine partnership, and he set aside the documents with which he had been occupied to regard her with an expression of measured amusement. "The Countess is, as you know, a woman whose opinion carries considerable weight in matters of educational policy," he said, gesturing for her to sit beside him. "I took the liberty some months ago of forwarding to her certain documents pertaining to the school's curriculum and pedagogical approach. Her letter of response indicated a genuine interest in observing the institution firsthand. I have, therefore, invited her to stay at Ravensford for a period of 2 weeks, during which she will have the opportunity to assess the school according to her own criteria." "And you did not think to inform me of this beforehand?" Clara inquired, though her tone was more amused than truly aggrieved. "I believed it preferable to allow you the opportunity to prepare naturally, rather than through the mediation of my foreknowledge," he replied with a slight smile. "You possess, my dear Clara, a remarkable capacity to rise to extraordinary occasions when permitted to do so without excessive advance warning. I have observed that when you are aware of an impending challenge, you tend toward overthinking, whereas when you encounter it with minimal preparation, you respond with the authenticity and conviction that is precisely what the Countess will find most compelling." The fortnight that followed was occupied by a flurry of preparation that was rendered somewhat chaotic by the fact that Clara was simultaneously attending to the daily operations of the school and making minor but significant adjustments to the curriculum in anticipation of the Countess's arrival. Yet as the date of the visit approached, she found herself acquiring an almost fatalistic calm, recognition that either her work would speak for itself or it would not, and that no amount of frantic preparation could alter that fundamental reality. The Countess arrived on a Thursday afternoon, descending from her carriage with the bearing of someone accustomed to scrutiny and deference in equal measure. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with steel-grey hair arranged with severe elegance, and eyes that seemed to perceive far more than what lay on the surface of any given situation. The Duke received her with formal courtesy, but it was toward Clara that her attention was primarily directed. "The Duchess," she said, extending her hand with a gesture that suggested acknowledgement of something beyond mere social obligation. "I have been curious to meet you for some months now. Your husband's letters regarding the school have been remarkably detailed and, I confess, remarkably enthusiastic, in a manner that is quite uncharacteristic of his usual reserve. I hope the school itself will provide a more comprehensive testimony than any letter might convey," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the acceleration of her pulse. The 2 weeks that followed constituted perhaps the most exhausting period Clara had experienced since assuming her position. The Countess attended lessons, observed the girls during their recreational hours, examined the school's accounts and administrative records, and conducted extensive interviews with both Clara and the faculty regarding pedagogical philosophy and practical implementation. She asked penetrating questions, identified inconsistencies, and generally conducted herself with the rigor of someone genuinely committed to understanding whether the school represented a meaningful innovation or merely an exercise in fashionable philanthropy. It was on the final evening of her visit that the Countess requested a private conversation with Clara. They sat in the drawing room at Ravensford, the spring evening soft beyond the windows, and the Countess regarded Clara with an expression of such intensity that Clara found herself unable to speculate regarding its meaning. "Your school," the Countess said finally, "is not precisely what I anticipated. I confess that I expected to encounter an institution governed by the particular aesthetic preferences of its benefactress, one in which certain subjects were emphasized at the expense of others, based upon what the proprietor believed to be appropriate for young women. Instead, I have found something far more significant, an educational philosophy predicated upon the radical notion that the female intellect is capable of rigorous engagement with demanding subject matter, and that society does young women a profound disservice by permitting conventional notions of feminine propriety to constrain the development of their intellectual capacities." She paused, and Clara saw the faintest suggestion of a smile cross her features. "I intend to recommend to certain individuals of influence in London that they direct their attention toward the Ravensford Foundation. I suspect that within 5 years, this school will become something approaching a model for progressive educational institutions throughout the country. And I further suspect that you, Your Grace, will become something approaching an authority on the subject of feminine education, a position that will bring with it both considerable influence and considerable scrutiny." "I am not certain I am prepared for such a prospect," Clara admitted quietly. "None of us are ever truly prepared," the Countess replied. "We are simply offered the opportunity to respond authentically to circumstances as they arise. The fact that you have maintained both intellectual integrity and genuine compassion toward your students suggests to me that you will navigate whatever consequences arise from this school's success with considerably more grace than many would manage." When the Countess departed the following day, she carried with her not merely documents and observations, but an implicit endorsement that would, in the months to come, transform the school from being regarded as an eccentric provincial experiment into something approaching a beacon of progressive educational thought. And Clara, watching the carriage disappear down the tree-lined drive, understood that yet another transformation had occurred, one that she had not anticipated and could not entirely control, but which had been rendered possible by the Duke's unwavering commitment to her capabilities and his willingness to orchestrate circumstances in such a manner as to permit her to flourish. The letter arrived in late summer, bearing the seal of the Royal Society for the Advancement of Education, and informing Clara that she had been selected to deliver a lecture at their annual conference in London regarding the pedagogical methodologies employed at the Ravensford Foundation. The invitation was unprecedented. No woman had previously been invited to present at such a forum, and its receipt occasioned a degree of nervous agitation that Clara had not experienced since the initial establishment of the school. "You must accept," the Duke said without hesitation when she presented him with the letter, her own ambivalence evident in the manner with which she held the invitation, as though it might spontaneously ignite and consume her if she did not maintain careful control of it. "But the implications," Clara began, though she was already aware of what she intended to articulate. "The implications are that your work has acquired sufficient legitimacy and sufficient respect that even the most conservative elements of the educational establishment cannot deny its validity," he interrupted gently. "You will travel to London. You will deliver your lecture, and you will do so without apology or excessive concern regarding what others may think of your presumption." The journey to London, undertaken in late September, represented yet another crossing of thresholds that Clara had not anticipated traversing. She and the Duke travelled in his town carriage, accompanied by Eleanor, who had insisted upon serving as chaperone, despite the somewhat archaic nature of such precautions for a married woman. As they progressed toward the capital, Clara found herself oscillating between exhilaration and profound trepidation. The lecture hall was filled, not merely filled, but crowded to the point of discomfort, with educators, administrators, and curious society members craning for position to observe the woman who had apparently revolutionized the approach to feminine education in her provincial corner of England. Clara stood at the podium in a gown of deep emerald silk, the ring bearing the ducal crest visible upon her hand as she gripped the edge of the lectern, and she began to speak. What emerged was not a technical exposition, but rather a passionate articulation of fundamental principles regarding the nature of human potential and the manner in which society systematically constrained the intellectual development of half its population through the application of arbitrary restrictions based upon gender rather than capability. She spoke of the girls she had educated, girls who had arrived at the school believing themselves to be intellectually deficient because society had insisted upon it, and who had subsequently demonstrated extraordinary capacity for rigorous thought and genuine scholarship. She spoke of the waste inherent in permitting such capabilities to remain underdeveloped, of the loss to society when potential was deliberately suppressed in service to convention. The silence that followed her conclusion was absolute and profound, and then, gradually, the assembled audience began to applaud, not with the polite courtesy one extended to a woman who had acquitted herself adequately despite her gender, but with genuine recognition of the significance of what had been articulated. In the days that followed, Clara found herself at the center of a form of attention that was, in many respects, more demanding than the obscurity she had previously experienced. Invitations arrived from various quarters, requests for additional lectures, inquiries regarding the possibility of establishing similar schools in other regions. The Duke navigated these developments with his characteristic perspicacity, helping her distinguish between opportunities of genuine substance and those that represented merely fashionable enthusiasm. It was on the eve of their departure from London that the Duke surprised Clara with a gift, a small volume bound in soft leather, bearing her initials in gold upon its cover. She opened it to find her lecture transcribed in its entirety, with a preface written by no less a figure than the Dean of the Society. "This is for the record," the Duke explained, watching her read with an expression of mingled tenderness and amusement, "so that your words, your insights, your fundamental contribution to the conversation regarding education will persist beyond the moment of their articulation, so that years from now, decades perhaps, women will be able to encounter your ideas not through second-hand reporting or the mediation of others' interpretations, but directly, in your own voice." Clara's eyes blurred with tears as she looked up at him. "You have given me everything," she whispered. "Not merely marriage, but recognition. Not merely security, but agency. How can I ever adequately express gratitude for such gifts?" "By continuing to be precisely who you are," he replied, taking her hand. "By refusing to permit the world's attempts to diminish or constrain you to succeed. By living as testimony to the principle that authenticity and truth are more powerful than all the conventions society might marshal against them. This is the gift you give to me, Clara, the privilege of witnessing the fullness of your becoming." The morning room at Ravensford was filled with soft autumn light, the gardens visible beyond the windows, transformed by the particular beauty of October, leaves burning in shades of gold and crimson, the last roses persisting with stubborn dignity against the encroaching cold. Clara sat at her writing desk, occupied with correspondence that had become an increasingly significant portion of her daily responsibilities, when a sound from the hallway, the particular timbre of a child's voice raised in delighted excitement, drew her attention away from the letters before her. Thomas, their son, now 10 years old, burst into the room with the characteristic lack of restraint that distinguished him from his sisters, and which his father, Clara observed with amusement, seemed to regard as a source of considerable satisfaction. Behind him came Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, now a young lady of 17, and already acquiring the reputation of someone possessed of formidable intellectual capabilities. "Mama," Thomas announced with the breathlessness of genuine urgency, "Father has returned from London, and he has brought the copies of the new edition of your essays. The publisher has bound them in the most extraordinary leather, and they are being distributed to libraries throughout England." Clara rose from her desk and permitted her son to embrace her, though her eyes immediately sought the doorway through which, a moment later, the Duke himself appeared. 15 years had passed since that evening in the library, when he had first articulated the depth of his regard, and the intervening decade had rendered their partnership increasingly seamless and comprehensive. The school had expanded beyond its original provincial boundaries. Clara's writings on education had been collected and published. Their marriage had produced 3 children, Thomas and his twin sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret, each of whom displayed the intellectual curiosity and emotional intelligence that their mother had come to regard as the primary indication of a person's capacity to flourish. The Duke set down the leather-bound volumes and crossed the room to embrace Clara with the ease of someone for whom such gestures had long since transcended the boundaries of propriety and become simply the natural expression of profound affection. "The publisher informs me that this edition is already facing considerable demand," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with that same intensity of recognition that had characterized their initial encounter. "It appears that your work is acquiring the status of something approaching a foundational text in progressive educational circles." "Our work," Clara corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without your unwavering support and your willingness to permit me the autonomy to develop according to my own convictions." The Duke smiled, a smile that held within it all the tenderness of a man who had learned over a decade of marriage to see his wife not merely as the object of his affection, but as a collaborator in the ongoing project of creating a life predicated upon truth rather than convention. "I have done nothing more than recognize what was always present," he replied. "You have done the labor of becoming." That evening, after the children had been settled for sleep and the household had acquired the particular quietness that descended upon Ravensford in the hours after sunset, Clara found herself alone with her husband in the library, that space which had witnessed so much of their stories unfolding. A fire burned in the hearth and the Duke sat in one of the high-backed chairs, whilst Clara occupied the position beside him, her hand resting naturally within his own. "I wish to speak with you regarding a matter that has occupied my thoughts for some months now," the Duke said, his voice carrying that particular gravity that indicated something of significance impended. "The school has flourished beyond even my most optimistic projections, and your work has acquired a level of influence that extends far beyond our own county. There is a proposition that I have been considering, one that I believe warrants your serious contemplation." "Speak then," Clara invited, though she found herself curious regarding what development might have prompted such careful preamble. "There exists a movement afoot to establish a university college specifically designed to provide advanced education to women, an institution that would offer curricula comparable to those available to men, with the same rigorous standards and the same commitment to intellectual excellence. Several individuals of considerable influence have approached me with the proposal that you might serve as the principal founder and director of such an institution. It would require your relocation to London for much of the year. It would involve you in an undertaking of considerably greater scope than even the school has represented, and it would expose you to a degree of public scrutiny and opposition that may prove exhausting." He paused, allowing her the space to process what had been articulated, and then he continued. "I confess myself torn regarding whether to encourage you to accept or to advocate for your remaining here, where our life has achieved a comfortable equilibrium. But I also recognize that you have never been a woman content with comfortable equilibrium, and that you are capable of managing far more demanding challenges than this life has thus far required of you." Clara felt tears beginning to form as she comprehended the full significance of what he was offering, not merely an opportunity, but a recognition that transcended even their personal relationship. "What do you wish me to do?" she asked softly. "I wish you to choose according to the dictates of your conscience and your capacity," he replied. "Whatever you decide, I will support entirely. If you wish to remain here and expand the scope of the school, that is admirable and entirely sufficient. If you wish to undertake this larger project, I will accompany you to London and will ensure that our children receive education that reflects the principles you have spent a decade developing. Your happiness, your fulfillment, your sense that your existence is being lived authentically, these remain my primary concerns, as they have since the moment I first recognized what you were capable of becoming." Clara sat in silence for a long moment, contemplating the trajectory that her life had followed, from obscurity and dismissal to a position of influence and recognition through the agency of a man who had possessed the moral courage to challenge society's verdicts and the constancy to support her becoming without seeking to diminish or constrain it. "I will accept," she said finally, "but not because I seek greater influence or broader recognition. I will accept because there remain countless young women whose potential is being systematically suppressed by society's arbitrary constraints. And if I have the capacity to alter those circumstances, then I am obligated to attempt it." The Duke drew her close then, his embrace encompassing not merely his wife but his partner in the ongoing project of reshaping the world according to principles of authenticity and recognition rather than convention and constraint. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the ancient trees of Ravensford, and within the library, that space that had witnessed their entire story, two people sat in comfortable silence, aware that they had constructed something far more significant than a marriage. They had created a testament to the proposition that love, genuine and unconditional, possessed the power to remake not merely individual lives, but the very foundations upon which society rested. The ring upon Clara's finger caught the firelight as she rested her hand in his, the same ring that had been placed there a decade ago, bearing within its ancient metal the accumulated weight of family history and personal commitment. Yet it was no longer merely a symbol of obligation or romantic attachment. It had become, through the intervening years and the careful tending of mutual regard, a representation of something far more profound, the belief that some truths transcend the boundaries of propriety, that some loves demand to be acknowledged regardless of social consequence, and that the most profound transformations occur not in the public sphere, but in the quiet moments when two people choose, again and again, to see and to honor what is true. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, certainly, not without resistance from those quarters of society that regarded the expansion of women's education as a threat to fundamental social stability. But Clara faced that future without the anxiety that might have characterized her earlier self. She faced it secure in the knowledge that she was seen, truly seen by a man who had spent a decade demonstrating that his commitment to her worth transcended the vicissitudes of social opinion or the demands of conventional propriety. And in that security, in that unwavering recognition, she found the foundation upon which all her subsequent accomplishments would be built. In a world that constantly demands we conform, that insists we accept the verdicts society renders upon our worth and our possibilities, this story whispers a profound and revolutionary truth, that authentic recognition, true seeing, is one of humanity's most sacred and most transformative gifts. Clara Whitcombe's journey from invisible companion to woman of influence and consequence was not rendered possible through her own efforts alone, nor through the machinations of social advancement. It was rendered possible because one man possessed the moral courage to challenge society's narrative and the constancy to see beyond the conventional boundaries that others had accepted as immutable. Yet the moral extends beyond the romantic dimensions of their relationship. What this story truly articulates is the profound injustice inherent in permitting social convention to constrain human potential, particularly the potential of those whom society has deemed unworthy of recognition. Clara was neither less intelligent nor less capable in her moments of dismissal than she became in her moments of acknowledgement. The difference lay not in transformation of her essential self, but in the external validation that finally permitted her to trust what she had always known to be true about herself. This is the revolution that genuine love effects. It does not create worth where none existed, but rather refuses the world's permission to deny what was always present. It is radical not because it is sentimental, but because it is honest. It is transformative not because it changes the beloved, but because it provides the conditions in which the beloved can finally flourish according to her authentic nature. In our contemporary moment, we continue to live within systems of constraint, systems that are perhaps more subtle than the rigid proprieties of Victorian England, but no less effective in their diminishment of human possibility. We are constrained by economics, by educational systems that sort rather than nurture, by social media narratives that reduce complexity to digestible fragments, by the persistent message that our worth is contingent upon our productivity or our conformity. The moral of this story, then, is a call to revolutionary action of a most intimate kind, the action of truly seeing another person, not as they appear, not as society has designated them, but as they are in their essential integrity and possibility. It is a call to recognize that such seeing is not merely romantic gesture, but moral imperative. It is an insistence that we are all, in some measure, responsible for the worlds in which others are permitted to become themselves. And it is, finally, a testament to the possibility of transformation when authenticity is honored above propriety, when truth is permitted to override convention, and when love, real, honest, unguarded love, is recognized as the foundation upon which all genuine human flourishing rests. Did this story move you? Did you find yourself transported to the gaslit drawing rooms and intimate gardens of Victorian England, moved by the quiet revolution of two people choosing authentic connection over social convenience? We at Victorian Romance Audio Stories invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss a new story, each one carefully crafted to transport you to worlds where propriety conceals passion, where glances convey what words cannot, and where love demands to be acknowledged regardless of society's verdicts. Leave a comment below and tell us, what moment in Clara's journey resonated most deeply with you? Did you find yourself rooting for her recognition? Did the Duke's commitment to her transformation inspire you? We want to hear from you, your thoughts, your emotions, your own experiences of being truly seen, because it is through such connection that stories achieve their deepest power. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that they are seen, that they are worthy of recognition, that their authenticity matters more than society's approval. Let us know in the comments which character you identified with most, and whether you believe such transformative love is possible in our modern world. Subscribe, comment, share. Be part of the community of those who understand that the greatest romances are not those of fleeting passion, but of steadfast recognition and unwavering commitment to another's becoming. Thank you for joining us on Clara and Alexander's journey. We are grateful for every moment of your attention, every tear shed at their struggles, every smile at their triumphs. With profound gratitude and deepest appreciation, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team crafting tales of love, propriety, and transformation, one story at a time.